Ryan Devereaux is a journalist for The Intercept, which was co-founded by Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras of Edward Snowden fame, together with Jeremy Scahill. Well, thanks for taking the time to join us, Ryan.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
And let's move on to the topic regarding Mexico, which I believe you've visited and covered lately, the disappearances of the 43 students, the murders. And I believe you interviewed one of the parents of the victims, and
Yeah.
the conclusions of both the parents and the Human Rights Committee, the findings come to the conclusion that the murders or disappearances must have been coordinated across the state security apparatus. What can you tell us about that? What is the big takeaway from the story for us, for Mexicans, for Americans, and world citizens alike, as well as your experience going down to Mexico?
Yeah. So I first came down to Mexico to cover the Ayotzinapa story in November last year. I came down for about a month, and I spent a good amount of time with students at the school, the survivor students, the surviving students, and parents of the disappeared students. And then I subsequently, after that, I obtained a number of files from the PGR's investigation. So the testimonies and statements of alleged Guerreros Unidos members and municipal police from Iguala and Cocula. That investigation has now been those same files have now been made public by PGR finally, but the conclusions that I came to in the process of my reporting are essentially the same conclusions that the Inter-American Commission investigators came to, which they published in their massive report a few weeks back, which is that there is ample evidence, documentary evidence, which shows that at the very minimum, basically every level of the security apparatus in and around Iguala that night was at least aware of what was going on. Cocula and Iguala Municipal Police were directly involved in attacking the students and disappearing them. But the Army knew what was happening in real time as was happening. There were Army patrols from the 27th Infantry Battalion and others, including plainclothes military intelligence on the ground while all of this was happening. The ministerial police, the state police, the federal police all played interlocking roles throughout the night. And this is what journalists, a lot of us have been saying, for months. And the Inter-American Commission came to the same conclusions. And obviously, the federal government, PGR, has, fought sort of assertions from the beginning. I think that there's just so much more work that needs to be done in determining what really happened that night and why it happened. I think that the theory that was floated by the Inter-American team that the students may have inadvertently boarded a bus with drugs bound for the United States is certainly a provocative and interesting theory. I think that what you have in that case is a case in which these students found themselves in a really terrible situation in that the in and around Iguala, the line between organized crime and the security forces there had disappeared a long time ago. When I was down there, we went to a church in Iguala that's become a sort of organizational hub in the area where family members of people who had disappeared in before the students disappeared came, and they were given the opportunity to tell their stories and register uh, for a database that was the idea was to collect DNA from these family members in an attempt to sort of identify some of the people who were being pulled out of all of these mass graves around Iguala. And it was like 80 or 90 people who showed up in the church just that one day, who were all coming forward with their own experiences of family members who'd been disappeared. So my point is that um, that area it was just sort of awash in fear and impunity, and I think that's what this case really underscored. And local security forces, the police, and the military all play a role in it. They're all implicated. It's a story that says so much about the sort of epidemic of enforced disappearances across Mexico and the drug war, and really which the United States bears just tremendous responsibility for. In that, the United States prohibition policies help to fuel a black market, which undermines the authority of the state. And, U.S. weapons flow into Mexico basically unabated, and the United States, sends billions of dollars in military, law enforcement, and intelligence aid, equipment, training, support to Mexican security forces that year after year are implicated in gross human rights abuses. So, we're all sort of bound up in this mess together, and I think that this case, the Ayotzinapa case, just really just drove that point home. It's tremendously sad. It's the saddest story that I've ever covered before. Just talking to the parents and thinking about what it would be like to go through what they've gone through over the last years. It's awful.
And state terror is nothing new. If you look at it in history and around the world in different countries today, we see state terrorism. And what I find interesting here in Mexico is when it happens in Mexico, all Mexicans know. They know that the government was involved one way or another. And sometimes I get foreign students from Europe and the U.S. and they have a really hard time with some of these things. They're a bit too naive, I guess. But I had an interesting story regarding when the disappearances happened. We have a lot of foreign students, exchange students, and some were down there near Ayotzinapa traveling, and they were leaving in a van, like a tourist vehicle, a small van.
Yeah.
And the police were attempting to stop them, and they wouldn't stop because, as you mentioned, it's such a gray area. You know who's stopping you, if they really are police or if they are narcos, or if they are police working with the narcos. So you don't want to stop for the police. And so they didn't stop, and they ended up shooting. The cops ended up shooting at the vehicle, and they shot one of our foreign students from our school.
That was one of your students? I know the story you're talking about.
Yeah, they shot him in the butt, apparently. I'm not sure, but I think it was,
Wow.
Yeah, so he was...
I remember when that story came out. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to talk about the other story you mentioned as well, being a Mexican journalist. And I've spoken with British journalist based here in Guadalajara who writes for Vice, and he's written about it as well, that on average one Mexican journalist is murdered per month now by the narco state.
It's incredible. Like, people would ask me when I came back, like, isn't that scary to do that sort of reporting in Mexico? But for a white journalist in the United States, there's just no comparison it's hard for me to even answer that sort of question, because what journalists in Mexico face, like Mexican journalists, especially local reporters in some of these communities, is just tremendous fear. And it's just an incredible level of danger. And there are journalists in Mexico who are doing amazing work despite those sorts of threats. There are some very, very good, serious investigative reporters in Mexico, and I have, the utmost respect for them and what they're able to do, despite the conditions as they are. It's a really overwhelming set of topics. Security in Mexico, the narco state, and the drug war. It's just overwhelming.
And what might you say? We know this is happening in Mexico, and we've heard of the stories of the U.S. journalists, back 20 years ago, Gary Webb, who was portrayed by Jeremy Renner in Kill the Messenger last year, the Hollywood movie, as well as Michael Hastings, who wrote for the Rolling Stone. They died under suspicious circumstances. I'm of the opinion that the U.S. government was involved somehow. I don't know what are your thoughts regarding these few examples of American journalists that have either died under suspicious circumstances or things have happened to them.
Well, so I've written about Gary Webb's story before, and sort of what happened with him. And you know, Gary Webb's family maintains that he did kill himself,
Hmm.
that he did in fact take his own life. I mean, the story of the way in which his life unraveled there at the end. Kill the Messenger, the book, is really worth reading to dig into that. Um, it's totally tragic. I mean, a phenomenal, great reporter who, you know, uh, was by and large really on the right track in his reporting, and actually was just re-reporting, revelations that the AP had made years before, the Associated Press. Um, Michael Hastings was a friend of mine. He was a friend and a mentor, and his death really hit a lot of us here in New York who knew him pretty hard. Um, I don't think that the U.S. government killed Michael. It was a tragic accident, but the thing that both Michael and Gary Webb had in common, I guess, is just that the work that they did is incredibly stressful, incredibly high stakes work, and it really can wear on an individual. And it is, they were both a credit to the profession, and it's just it does. The U.S. government doesn't need to assassinate journalists, nor should it, obviously. But the profession on its own can really wear a person down, and it's very difficult work. Yeah.
Okay, and my final question, your final thoughts as well as what words of wisdom would you have for the youth or the next generation, as well as conscientious citizens, citizens who should be doing their duty, always examining and questioning the government and making sure they're on the right track, and citizens that will continue to deal with these issues that the Intercept is writing about. So what are your final thoughts, as well as words of wisdom to the young people who seem a bit distracted today, and I wish that they would be focusing on some of these important issues.
Yeah, I don't know if I have that much wisdom to impart, but um, I just read a lot, and I mean there's a lot of fascinating stories out there, and it's easy to get overwhelmed with all of it, and it all seems pretty grim, and everything is horrifying and whatnot. But you know, I think it's important and really interesting once you start digging into the world that we live in right now. I mean, it's a complicated place, and there are so many stories to follow, and I think it's worthwhile to do.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan Devereaux, for your time. I highly recommend people check out your reports at theintercept.com. Are there any websites that you recommend in addition?
No, I mean, there's a whole host of them. You can start there.